we will continue where we left off with the next part of the lecture. And we're going to be looking at food shortage or distribution. So when we kind of look at, and we did talk a little bit about this population growth and food demand, we see that, global population is projected to reach about 9.7 billion. And, conservative estimates is about 60% increase in food production is kind of needed to meet that increasing growing demand. But on top of that, we have climate change, and how it's kind of posing a significant threat to food production, variable weather patterns, floods, droughts, heat waves, and how does that kind of adversely affect crops worldwide. We also look at the environmental impacts of agriculture, and sustainable farming practices. There's also such a huge demand for meat and biofuel. And how does that kind of contribute to deforestation and soil degradation and kind of exacerbates climate change? In the previous lecture, we talked about food wastage paradox and how, despite efforts to increase production, approximately 1.3 billion tons of food is still kind of wasted annually. And so you have this huge paradox where perfectly good food is discarded and, while millions of people still suffer from hunger. So we do need this urgent need, for sustainable solution. And how are we going to address the challenges of feeding a growing population? And that kind of requires food production efficiency, resource management, promotion of sustainable food decisions to reduce wastage and also to kind of ensure global food security, particularly among the world's poorest. So when we look at food shortage, and food scarcity does not necessarily stem from insufficient production or crop failure. And when we look at the historical perspective, major famines reveal it's basically government policies and distribution problems that were to blame for widespread food shortage and hunger. So, for example, the Irish potato famine and several famines in, Indian subcontinent. The countries involved were actually exporting food abroad. It wasn't only food shortage, but the lack of political will to efficiently distribute food that contributed to these famines. So effective food distribution is still a major problem, plaguing efforts to end world hunger. And so basically, when we look at production limiting factors, and we know that plants are of primary importance for the production of human food and animal feed. We also eat meat, but for that you need plants too. You probably don't realize it, but in order to produce 1 kilogram of meat, a cow needs to produce at least 200 kilos of plant-based feed. And so besides being very nutritious for humans and animals, plants are also very nutritious for plant pathogens, for example, your mold fungi, your rotting bacteria. And these parasites usually can cause crop loss, up to about 25% of total food production worldwide. And it's only in the 19th century that we realized that plant diseases, like human diseases, can be caused by microorganisms. So, for example, in 1845, that a pathogen named Phytophthora infestans, which basically means plant destroyer in Latin, wiped out, potato crops in Western Europe, and that caused a major famine. And 1 million people died of hunger, and another million of Irish people emigrated to the US just because of this single plant disease. And the devastating effect on the society triggered scientists to investigate the cause of plant diseases. And hence we have this new field of science of plant pathology that was born. And plant pathology, it's still very highly relevant when you realize that in the coming decades, we humans desperately need to increase crop production, not lose it. And so you can imagine that research on how we can protect our crops against plant disease and pests is of primary importance. And so besides pests and diseases, plants can also suffer stress from suboptimal conditions, because plants grow by gaining energy through photosynthesis, and the process in which they fix aerial carbon dioxide into sugar. In this process, they use solar energy as energy inputs. And we know that plants also need water for both photosynthesis and in their cells. Um, volume. And so although crop growers try to optimize their soil conditions, very often crops suffer from drought or water excess, but also salinity, heat, and other so-called abiotic factors that can reduce your growth of plants. So basically, as a complete consequence, your complete harvest can go to waste if distressful conditions occur at the wrong time of the harvest season. Okay. So for example, heat, leads to elongated stems and it's probably at the expense of yield, and that can lead to sterility of these plants. And usually when you talk about heat, that comes with severe drought as well. And so that, that causes massive crop loss at a global scale. And so one way to kind of combat that is to irrigate agricultural fields. But when you kind of irrigate, water is kind of used by plants and or partly just evaporates. Basically, the salt dissolves in the water, stay in the soil and accumulate. So after several years, basically this leads to heavily salinized soil on which crops will hardly grow anymore. And in other parts of the world, floods can cause massive damage to crops that are typically intolerant to plant stresses. So, for example, paddy rice, if any of you are familiar, they are grown in a layer of water, but they cannot survive when it's completely covered by a layer of flood water. Um, Plant scientists, all around the world have kind of been trying to look at doing research to kind of study the molecular mechanisms that can enhance tolerance of plants to these various stresses. Okay, but still, we're still a long way to go. And now we move on to animal protein. Okay, some species are used for worldwide for meat production, such as your cattle, pork, chicken, marine fish, salmon. So if eating animal protein, it kind of makes sense to ask what are more and what are less sustainable choices. And so one way of comparing species is to look at the feed conversion ratio. And that basically reflects how efficiently an animal converts feed into biomass for human nutrition. And so to make it fair, the comparison is not based on the natural feed wild animals would use, but on food pellets used by farmers. So the composition and energy content of these pellets is exactly known. For example, salmons are very efficient users of feed. One needs only 1.1 kilo of pellet to get 1 kilogram of salmon. And two important reasons for this excellent feed conversion rate is that salmon does not spend a lot of energy, for keeping a high body temperature, and the water carries most of their weight. Also, let's say we talk about chicken, right? Chicken also shows a good rate because they have a shorter lifespan. And salmon uses your feed efficiently, but is it produced in a sustainable manner? And so, basically salmon usually eat other marine fishes. Does it make sense to use fish to produce fish? But nutritional research showed that up to 1/3 of salmon feed can be of plant origin, such as soy protein and vegetable oils. However, fish meal and fish oils are required as well. For the small and fat-rich species, are used that humans do not like to eat. So basing on that efficient use of that feed and the in-part plant-based products, the fish in fish out ratio decreased to being just a little above 1 these days. So however, hence, if eating animal protein from farm animals, efficient sources are finfish, aquaculture, and also chicken. And let me move on to famine. So in 1943-44, Bengal was kind of struck by a terrible famine that killed between 1.5 to about 3 million people. And so this economist, Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, who witnessed the famine as a child, has argued that the rice harvest of 1943 was not that bad. But then why did so many people die? Does the date suggest something to you? And if you kind of look at that, Bengal at that time was part of the British India, and England was at war. And according to Sen, grain prices rose steeply due to inflation caused by frenzied wartime activity. So price peaks did not affect everybody to the same extent, though. Urban laborers in Calcutta received subsidized food because they were vital to the war effect. But agricultural laborers were left to their own devices. The grain was there, but they could no longer afford it. Also, in other words, the Bengal famine was not um, the Bengal famine was not the result of your production failure, but it was also production failure. And it was, the Bengal famine was also, it wasn't a result of production failure, but of a distribution failure. So basically, sense analysis is contested because other scholars have argued that the harvest did fail and that the British government, moreover, refused to ship relief supplies to Bengal because food and shipping was needed to provision armies elsewhere. So again, more distribution failure and also which was caused by the war. But other factors than war can also make countries vulnerable to distribution failures. And now we move, to the Great Irish Famine of the years of 1840 to 1840 to 1850s. And here the harvest did fail. The potato, which was Ireland's main food crop, was infected by a fungus-like pathogen, and that made it inedible, not just once, but several years in a row. So it did not only happen in Ireland, okay, it spread all over the northwestern Europe. However, only in Ireland, mass starvation occurred and about 1 million people died. But what actually, why only Ireland? In this case, it was not a war. Ireland was at peace, but what kind of contributed and what was the fact that the Irish population, heavily kind of relied on potatoes. So there was nothing else that was really grown. And Ireland had very poor soils and a wet climate, so grains do not grow well. And in the 18th century, when potato was introduced, peasants all around the country started growing them. And so population density increased, and so did the dependency on a single crop. But when it failed, Ireland was in serious trouble, but that was not all. Inequality in Ireland was also great. There was also a tiny elite of wealthy landowners, a very, very small middle class, and a large mass of very poor rural families. When the potato crop failed, the elite and middle class felt little solidarity with the poor, and those that did not want to help could not provide so for many people in need. And the way in which relief in Ireland was done, it was not organized, and that did not help it either. So in most other European countries, basically local relief organizations distributed at least some food or cash among the poor, not much, but kind of just enough to prevent starvation. In Ireland, the main form of like poor relief consisted of like workhouse where the poor were interned, and the workhouse regime was so harsh that people did not go there until they were absolutely desperate. So families were split up and inmates had to give up their land. Nevertheless, at the peak of the famine, the workhouses were overflowing. And also, last but not least, there was also political and cultural components to the story. And in the middle of the 19th century, Ireland was officially part of the UK, but in practice, there was a huge distance between the government in London and the Irish people, not just physically. The English tended to see the Irish as backwards and uncivilized, and the Irish members of parliament represented the small and privileged Irish elite rather than the Irish people. And so they did very, very little to kind of raise help for Ireland. And it has also been argued that the British government deliberately starved the Irish to reform and discipline them. But that's actually a very, very strong claim, but it's certainly true that the government response to the famine was slow and inadequate. So let's go back and look at Bengal, okay? So even if Sen was wrong in his assessment of the rice harvest, he was kind of right about something else because famines are not the result of just production problems, but also distribution problems. And again, when we kind of look at wars these days, and societies that cope best with food crisis are societies that have diversified economies, truly democratic and responsive governments, low inequality, safety nets for those who cannot cope by themselves. So basically, it's not just it's not a food shortage, but it has a lot to do with the distribution problem. So again, coming back, when we're talking about feeding more and more people, and and how we're going to eliminate world hunger today. How much food that do we need? And conservative estimates basically, about 60%, because especially when we talk about increasing demand of meat, and the primary feed for your cattle industry is basically your corn and soybean. Apart from that, now we'll look at food statistics, okay? So we see that hunger affects about 21% of the population in Africa, 9% in Asia, and 9.1% in Latin America. And nearly 1 in 3 people in the world do not have adequate access to food, in 2020. And especially with COVID-19, it was almost 320 million people in just 1 year. And also, we are looking at now that there's going to be a lot more urbanization, and agricultural practices really does vary worldwide. And persistent hardship economies, from economic hardship that came about from COVID-19, and we see that the recovery pattern has been really uneven across the world. High-income countries, they recover at a faster rate, but low-income countries a lot more slower. And if you kind of look at this, you see that majority of the population, that's kind of malnourished is actually based in Asia. But you have to remember that the world's most populous countries like China and India are based in Asia. But if you kind of look at, and I do have a picture of this, and if you kind of look at this really does kind of reiterate that point. Even though in Asia there's the highest number of people that are hungry, but we see that in terms of moderate and severe food insecurity, that is less than half, okay? But when we look at Africa, moderate and severe food insecurity, it's almost about 70%, and severe food insecurity. And again, this is because of, just think of, the most populous continent right now, and that is actually in Asia. But if we're kind of looking at, just the African region, there higher amounts of the population are actually starving or facing severe food insecurity. Um, Also, I want to kind of highlight this, the triple burden of malnutrition, where we have stunting and wasting, we have overweight being an obesity, and we have hidden hunger. And hidden hunger basically is a deficiency in micronutrient that not only affects the developing world, but also the developed world. Basically, the lack of iron, for example, that's a nutrient, a micronutrient that we need, and that causes anemia. Also, we can talk about wasting and stunting and undernutrition. So wasting basically refers to low weight for height, and it's often caused by acute protein or energy deficiency. And usually this is triggered by short-term events like severe illness, lack of access of food, or inadequate food intake. And the consequences of this is basically your developmental delays and mortality, especially in children. You can somebody who's experiencing wasting can recover relatively quickly with proper nutrition and healthcare. But on the other hand, if you're stunted, it's very difficult and often incomplete to kind of recover. You really require intensive nutritional intervention and supportive measures. And stunting basically is low height for age, and is usually often caused by chronic malnutrition during early childhood. And it's actually a result of long-term or inadequate access to nutritious food or repeated infections in early childhood. And the consequences of this is pretty much permanent and irreversible, leading to impaired cognitive development, higher risk of chronic disease, and reduced productivity. And so this is the current, that's happening in the world. You either see huge populations that are experiencing overweight and obesity, and that's usually in the developed world. And in developing countries, you see undernutrition, but also across a broad spectrum, you see that hidden hunger that exists because we are not getting enough micronutrients, which particularly come from your fruits and vegetable sources. Also here, we see contrasting nutritional health challenges in low and lower middle income countries compared to your upper middle and high income countries. So basically, we can also see that, food insecurity is a lot higher in women, and there's a growing gender gap in food insecurity because historically women tend to be disproportionately affected by health and economic crisis in a number of ways. And so basically when we kind of look what is some of the main drivers. And if we can see over here, particularly when we talk about women, the green and the blue lines, they're always significantly a lot higher, not only in Africa, but also in the world. And so what is that is driving? What are the factors, the systemic issues that contribute to this disparity? A lot of times women are not allowed to be landowners, so we have that limited access to resources. That also brings about, income disparities, and especially in Japan as well, there's a huge gap in income. In a lot of countries as well, women who hold same positions as men do not get equal income. We can also look at education, particularly in a lot of places in Africa and Asia. They'd rather educate the men rather than the female. So you have the education disparity, discriminatory cultural practices, the lack of maternal and child health. They are not allowed to kind of be involved in the decision-making process. We can also, look at, what has happened in China, the one-child policy. And after 35 years, I mean, they started it's like 1980s, and then they reversed it to the two-child policy. And currently it's a three-child policy. But during that time, when it was a one-child policy, a lot of young females were killed, babies were killed, female infanticide. And it was this Confucian legacy that, there is no behavior more unfilial than to have no male descendants. And so women have to move in with their husband, they don't have to have that social security. And, because women cannot work on farms, so it's kind of thought that the men will be able to take care of their families, okay? And the daughter-in-law will kind of take care of her parents, in her father or mother-in-law. And so that, and we kind of look at the consequences, and we'll look into that a little bit more when we look at population issues, on how the one-child policy has really kind of affected China's economy as well as population growth rates. In terms of global trends as well, we see that, there's increasing amount of people that are being overweight. We see increasing amount of anemia in women, obesity also increasing. But we see stunting and exclusive breastfeeding and low birth weight kind of improving. So, in lower developed countries, basically undernutrition, infectious disease, limited healthcare, water quality, poor sanitations are the ones that really driving this nutrient deficiencies and food security, and also health problems. But in the upper developing countries, we see, there's just an overabundance of food, sedentary lifestyles, unequal access to healthy food, stress and mental health. We also see, disparities that kind of exist in infrastructure, education, the economy, and how all this kind of drives up this nutrition indicators. So what are some of the major driving factors as well is, as we can see right now, conflict. We have seen in the past decade a rise in countries on the brink of famine, fueled by conflict, violence, and instability. And basically, over 80% of school-age children, that live in a country grappling with one of these forms of fragility, are severely malnourished. We also see climate extremes, like I said, heavy snow, or you have droughts, and then you have severe floods, and it's particularly making countries that are solely dependent on agriculture a lot more vulnerable to hunger crisis. And then we have economic downturns. We see rising food prices, inflation, and families are unable to make difficult choices. If we look at processed food, they're so much more cheaper compared to your whole foods. And so it contributes to poor dietary quality, especially among children and vulnerable populations. And again, unaffordability, because you cannot keep up with the increasing costs. And it's due to the complex political and economic factors within this food system, and that kind of creates that barrier to accessing good, nutritious food. Apart from that, we can also look at some of the underlying causes of this poverty and inequality. They are very complex and multifaceted, and involves various interconnected factors. So, for example, unequal distribution of income. So higher individual incomes have better access to resources, opportunities, and that kind of exacerbates the wealth gap. Productive assets, okay, land, capital, technology, and how that kind of perpetuate poverty, especially when you talk about ownerships, okay. This and those that are kind of lacking these assets basically cannot generate an income and improve their economic status. Basic services, all right, like healthcare, sanitation, education, all can hinder upward mobility. Um, and we also have, COVID-19 pandemic has basically kind of intensified these existing inequalities and pushed many people into poverty. And that was what was said by the UN and WHO. Basically, a lot of the improvements that they've made, especially with talking about food security, was kind of wiped out just during that 2-year period. We can also look into structural vulnerabilities, okay? Because with gender, for example, women, unequal access to education, employment, high unemployment rates among youths, and we see that happening in China right now, even though they have, really good access to education, and that can also trap people in that cycle of poverty. Ethnicity, and looking at the color of your skin to give you jobs, and that is still prevalent in very much in a lot of parts of the world. Historical injustices, land dispossessions, and limited access to basic services for, indigenous people, and limited accessibility for people with disabilities, exclusion from economic and social activities, and all that just kind of contribute to poverty. So, with this, basically kind of looking at the climate, economic, and conflict, you can go through this yourself, but we can see, for example, let me just explain this. Climate, it negatively affects agricultural productivity because, your crops are either lost in floods or droughts, and that kind of causes increase in food prices. And then that kind of decreases the quantity and the quality and the dietary diversity. It can also lead to crop contamination and outbreak of pests. So basically, all of these are very, very much related, okay? And in all these multiple drivers, their impact kind of varies. And so we need to have trade-off and synergies that need to be considered, whether or not positive or negative effects, and how it all kind of relates back to food security and nutrition. So it's a very, very complex interaction that we have to look at production, consumption, and waste, and that has that ripple effects. So policies can basically complement or have unintended negative consequences. So, you can just go through this. It's just more for your general understanding on how these various factors can really affect food security and nutrition. We also have the impact of wars. And for example, like I mentioned just now, societies that best cope with food crisis, basically have this diversified economies, truly democratic, really responsive governments, low inequality and safety nets, okay? And when you look at, Syria, the civil war in 2011, the displacement of millions of people led to destruction of infrastructure, disrupted agriculture, caused displacement. And there was an absence of a democratic and responsive governments, and they lacked safety nets. So it really led to high inequality and also, increase the number of vulnerable population and caused widespread food insecurity. Somalia, on the other hand, that political instability that was going on, coupled together with conflict, drought, okay, and that kind of limited access to basic services. On top of that, there was this really very weak governance and political fragmentation and lack of safety nets. And, it's still happening today. Zimbabwe, there was an economic downturn, there were land reform policies that were put into place where they were taking land back from rich white owners, okay, and giving it to poor farmers. And Zimbabwe was the breadbasket of Africa. And so when commercial farmers had to hand back land to Zimbabwe farmers, through forced acquisition, invasion, seizures, violence, sanctions, what happened was there was a significant decline in agricultural production. And why did that happen? Basically, because the farmers who got the land didn't have the education, the skills, the capabilities to grow that much, to grow crops on a much more wider scale. So the lack of resources, skills and experience, basically, they ran into famine as well. And similarly as well in Sri Lanka, and that was pretty interesting. Reason, because of inflation and how much they're owing to countries worldwide. Basically, they shift over to organic farming, but it wasn't done rightly. And so the amount of they thought that by reduce by stop by not purchasing pesticides and fertilizers, which requires huge amounts of US dollars to get them, and shifting to organic farming, they'll be saving a lot of money, but they did not, there was a decrease in productivity, and instead they had to import a lot of their necessities from around the world, and that basically kind of increased their expenditure again. So, we look at Ukraine and Russia, and they again, they grow some of, most of our grains come from over there. Exports have stopped, uncertain future harvests, restricted access to fertilizers, and that in during that period of time as well in 2023, there were, especially in Japan, where they rely a lot on fertilizers and they get it from Ukraine, and it just caused fertilizers price to skyrocket. Okay, and there were a lot of export restrictions. Again, as well, we can look at this poverty and inequality and policies and governments and how they can cause economic slowdowns and conflict. But again, we have to look at improving food safety, quality standards, minimizing any unintended consequences that can drive up the cost of food. So when kind of looking at, especially when we are looking at, the key drivers to about 2070, and we have to kind of turn our attention to Africa. And as we will learn in the upcoming modules that, currently Africa has one of the youngest population. Their average age is 19 years old. But if you kind of look at North America, Europe, the average age is about 38 years old. Asia is about 31. So majority of, population growth is going to be happening in Africa. Also, we look at income growth, especially with like China, and a lot of developing countries starting to have that increase in income. There's been an increase of demand of meat, okay? And then that kind of increases the amount of wheat and grain that needs to be grown, soybeans, corn. We also need innovations, okay? And when we're kind of looking at all of this as well, we see that, higher atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, and how that will lead to lower nutrient densities in some crops and forage species, and greater stress on crops, livestock, and the people who tend them. We will also start to see changes in the prevalence of distribution of pests and diseases. Also in terms of international trade options, it will be increasingly important to enable rapid adaptations to pronounce regional differences in climate fluctuations, because like in Hokkaido and Sapporo, they used to grow a lot of peach, but these days they are shunning away from growing peaches because of the climate change that's happening over there, and there's this excessive amount of rainfall. So basically, we need to kind of look into what are we going to do, especially when we look at 2070, okay? And when we need to kind of increase the amount of food that we're producing, because food becomes less dependent on trade and agriculture, specifically when we talk about, land and water resources. We want to decrease and reduce our water and land footprint. So, do we use technology, machines to kind of make sure that we are efficiently using resource management and to boost production, or do we look at alternative methods of farming? And from 2045 to 2070, we want healthy diets, and this is part of the Sustainable Development Goals that you have read about. Okay, so we want to increase the availability of nutritious, safe, and diverse foods, and ensuring adequate and continuous affordable access and the utilizations of foods. Okay, so basically, we want to make sure that we also kind of respect individual food preferences, cultures, and aspirations. For the second objective, when we talk about equitable and inclusive livelihoods, basically over here, poverty is the primary cause of food insecurity throughout the world. And a key driver of poverty basically is due to low productivity. And most of the world's poor live in rural areas. So basically, this low economic returns to agricultural production, processing in rural traditional systems are basically the key source of global inequality. So we want to look at innovations that can boost labor productivity among the poor, because labor power is typically the most valuable assets. And they also often own very little land, livestock, machinery, or other forms of productive capital. So people everywhere aspire to equal and inclusive opportunities, but basically are denied basic human rights due to, accidental geography of their birth, color of their skin, their gender, and their sexual orientation. So basically, when we look at food systems, they're a powerful avenue to address equity and inclusion. Also, we want to have, because of adverse shocks, we want safety nets so that those unable to work are assured of unbroken access to healthy diets. So again, prioritizing individual rights to privacy, personal data. We want to look at cultural, economic, and political life should reflect broader participation of all interested persons. We want to decentralize governance power and also enhance opportunities for coordination among parties. And if we look at COVID-19, we need to look at it's absolutely necessary to build resilience to shock and stresses, because there's going to be more and more pandemics in the future. We also can look at environmental and climate sustainability, and finally, this total factor productivity. So basically, what we want to do is we want to move away from simple partial productivity metrics such as yield. And we basically want to develop and consistently employ measures, that maximize the number of people nourished healthily and sustainability while minimizing environmental and healthcare costs. So basically, we must kind of establish thresholds beyond which agroecosystems and the climate become unlikely to recover from excessive stresses. So when properly constructed, right, it summarizes your TFP basically summarizes the returns to all natural and man-made inputs, and especially in workers' health and labor productivity. So when we have a greater focus on total factor productivity, it will help to promote a livable incomes for the poorest, who often possess very little, economic assets. So again, just to kind of move away from output per land, but to kind of look at the bigger picture. And so we're kind of looking at increasing the people who are nourished and also decreasing environmental and health costs. And with that, I will end here. And have a good week, guys, and complete your quiz and your assignment.